Stay on your knees where you belong. The words didn't echo. They settled, heavy, into the polished hallway like something permanent, something that didn't need to be repeated to be understood. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale reflection across the marble floor that Marcus Reed had just finished cleaning, each tile still damp, still catching the glow like a quiet mirror. The yellow caution sign stood a few feet away, slightly crooked, ignored like most things in this building that didn't carry power. Ethan Caldwell didn't look down at it. He didn't look down at anything, really. Not the floor, not the man in front of him, not the small ripple of silence spreading through the hallway as a few students slowed their steps, their voices dropping, their eyes turning. Marcus held the handle of his mop steady, one hand wrapped around the worn wood, the other resting lightly at his side, his posture calm, almost still, as if he had been expecting something like this. Not this exact moment, but this kind of moment. The kind where someone decides who you are without asking. Ethan shifted his weight, the sole of his expensive shoe pressing just a little too close to the edge of the damp tile, his reflection bending slightly in the water below. "You missed a spot," he added, his voice lighter now, almost amused, like this was all a game he had already won. A faint chuckle came from somewhere behind him, quickly stifled, unsure whether it was safe to exist. Marcus didn't move right away, not because he was frozen, but because he was choosing not to rush. His eyes dropped briefly to the floor, not in submission, but in focus, tracing the thin line of water that hadn't yet settled, the faint streak that caught Ethan's attention. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, guiding the mop in a smooth, practiced motion, the fibers gliding across the surface with quiet precision. No sudden movements, no reaction, just work. The hallway seemed to narrow around them, the space tightening not physically, but emotionally, like the air itself was holding its breath. Ethan watched him for a second, then another, something unreadable flickering across his face before settling back into that familiar confidence, that inherited certainty that nothing in this moment could possibly touch him. "You hear me?" he said, a little sharper now, as if silence itself had started to irritate him. Marcus paused, just for a fraction of a second, then looked up, not fully, not confrontationally, but enough to meet Ethan's eyes in a way that didn't challenge, didn't provoke, but didn't disappear either. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, carrying none of the tension that filled the hallway. "I heard you. That was all. No apology, no explanation, just acknowledgement." And somehow, that made the silence heavier. A locker door clicked shut in the distance. Someone shifted their backpack. The faint buzz of a phone camera activating slipped into the background, unnoticed by most, but not by Marcus. He lowered his gaze again, returning to the floor, finishing the line of water with the same care as before, as if the moment hadn't changed anything at all. But something had shifted. Not in the hallway. Not in Ethan. Not yet. It was smaller than that. Quieter. Like the first crack in something that looked solid from the outside. Marcus wrung out the mop into the bucket beside him, the metal handle clinking softly against the rim, the sound clean, controlled, deliberate. He didn't rush. He never rushed. And as he straightened just slightly, adjusting his grip, there was a stillness in him that didn't match the role he stood in, a stillness that didn't belong to someone who needed permission to exist in that space. Ethan noticed it, even if he didn't understand it, even if he couldn't name it. And for the briefest moment, just a flicker, the confidence in his posture tightened, like something unseen had brushed against it. Then it was gone. Or at least, it seemed that way. The hallway did not return to normal after that moment. It only pretended to, voices slowly rising again, but softer, careful, like people testing whether it was safe to speak, and Marcus Reed moved through it the same way he always did, quietly, deliberately, pushing the bucket forward with a steady rhythm, wheels clicking against the polished floor every few feet, a sound that blended into the building's usual background noise, yet somehow felt more noticeable now, as if the space itself had started paying attention to him in a way it never had before, and he did not look back, not at Ethan, not at the students who lingered just a second longer than necessary, not at the faint glow of phone screens that captured fragments of something they did not fully understand. He simply continued down the corridor, turning left at the end where the light shifted slightly warmer near the maintenance doors, where the air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paper, a quieter part of the building where no one important ever stopped. And as the heavy door closed behind him, the noise of the hallway dulled into a distant hum, leaving only the soft drip of water from the mop and the low mechanical buzz of the ventilation system overhead. Marcus paused there for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of habit, letting the silence settle, his hand resting on the edge of the utility sink as he rinsed the mop head, watching the gray water spiral down the drain in slow circles, controlled, predictable, unlike the world just outside that door. And for a brief second, his reflection appeared in the stainless steel surface, slightly distorted, older than most people guessed. Lines around his eyes that came not from anger, but from years of seeing things clearly and choosing when to speak and when to remain still. He reached into the front pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, edges softened from being handled too many times. He did not open it. He did not need to. He already knew what was inside. Numbers, projections, a structure that only made sense if you knew how to read it. And most people in that building did not. Most people saw him and stopped there, never asking what else might exist beneath the uniform. Above him, a faint flicker of light from a loose fixture pulsed once, then steadied, and Marcus slipped the paper back into his pocket, tightening his grip on the handle of the mop as he straightened, his movements unhurried, intentional, as if time itself moved differently for him, as if he was not reacting to the day but moving through it on his own terms. Somewhere down the hall a clock chimed the half hour, a soft metallic tone that echoed through the maintenance corridor, and he turned toward the supply closet, pushing the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the space was small, barely wider than his outstretched arms, shelves lined with bottles, rags, and tools arranged with a precision that spoke of routine. But on the top shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of folded towels, sat something that did not belong to this world of cleaning and quiet invisibility, a slim, worn laptop, its surface scratched but carefully maintained. Marcus reached for it, his fingers brushing across the lid with a familiarity that contrasted sharply with the way he handled everything else in this building. He opened it slowly, the screen casting a cool blue light across his face as it powered on, and for a moment the reflection in his eyes changed, sharper, focused in a different way, the kind of focus that did not belong to someone who was overlooked. Lines of text appeared, numbers, charts, a document still open from the night before, the title faint but unmistakable, Caldwell Holdings Risk Assessment. And Marcus did not react, did not smile, did not frown. He simply looked, absorbing, calculating, the quiet hum of the machine blending with the building around him, as if this hidden corner held a version of reality that no one outside that door had any idea existed. And somewhere far above, in offices filled with glass and polished wood, decisions were being made without knowing that the man they had stepped over in the hallway was already several steps ahead of them. Upstairs, far above the quiet maintenance corridor, the building changed its tone completely. The air cooler, sharper, filtered through vents that never carried the scent of cleaning chemicals, only the faint trace of polished wood and expensive cologne. And inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair with the same ease he carried in the hallway, one arm draped casually over the backrest, his expression untouched by the moment that had already begun to circulate beyond his awareness. A tablet glowing faintly in front of him as numbers and headlines scrolled past without holding his attention for long, because none of it felt urgent to him. Not really. Not when every problem he had ever known had been handled by someone else before it could reach him. Across the table sat three executives, their suits tailored, their voices measured, discussing projections, timelines, and risk exposure with careful precision. But even as they spoke, their eyes flicked occasionally toward Ethan, not because he had earned that attention, but because of the last name he carried, Caldwell. A name that moved markets, that opened doors, that silenced questions before they could fully form. And at the head of the table, a large screen displayed a financial model, clean lines, rising curves, a future that looked stable on the surface, predictable, controlled, until one of the executives paused mid-sentence, his finger hovering over the remote as he adjusted his glasses slightly. "There is one variable we still have not accounted for," he said, his tone careful, not alarmed but not entirely confident either. The room shifted subtly, the kind of shift that did not announce itself but could be felt, a tightening of posture, a slight lean forward. Ethan barely glanced up, uninterested in complications that had not yet proven themselves to matter. "We have reviewed the external audits twice," another voice added, quieter now. "But there is a structural inconsistency in the liability distribution that does not align with our initial assumptions." The words hung in the air for a moment, technical, dense, easy to dismiss if you did not understand what they implied. Ethan tapped his fingers lightly against the table, a soft, rhythmic sound. "So fix it," he said, simple, dismissive, as if the solution was as effortless as the command. The executive hesitated, just briefly, then nodded, but the hesitation remained, unspoken, lingering beneath the surface like something waiting to be acknowledged. Outside the glass walls, assistants moved quickly through the corridor, heels clicking against the floor, voices low, controlled. The entire floor operating with a precision that depended on details being noticed, understood, corrected before they became problems. And yet, in that room, something small had already been overlooked, something that did not fit neatly into their projections, something that had been written, analyzed, and quietly set aside by someone who no longer had a seat at that table. Ethan finally leaned forward, glancing at the screen for a fraction longer this time, his reflection faint in the glass, layered over the numbers that continued to move without him. "We close this deal tomorrow, right?" he asked, not as a question, but as confirmation. And one of the executives answered immediately, "Yes, pending final review." The words sounded solid, but there was a subtle shift in tone, a weight that had not been there before. Ethan nodded once, satisfied, already disengaging, his attention drifting back to his tablet, to messages, to distractions that felt more real than abstract risk models. And as the meeting continued, the conversation returned to its steady rhythm, projections, confidence, forward motion. But beneath it, quiet and unnoticed, the same inconsistency remained, untouched, unresolved, like a loose thread in a fabric that looked perfect from a distance. And far below, in a small room that no one important ever entered, a man who had already seen that thread was still watching it unravel in his mind, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the calm understanding of someone who knew exactly where it would lead. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that barely registered against the quiet tension of the executive floor, and Marcus Reed stepped out slowly, his cart rolling behind him with the same steady rhythm, the wheels clicking once, twice, then settling into silence as he guided it across the thick carpet that muted every movement. This part of the building was different, not just in appearance, but in expectation. Every surface flawless, every reflection controlled, every detail designed to signal importance. And yet Marcus moved through it as if it were no different from the hallway downstairs, his posture unchanged, his pace unhurried, as if he belonged to a rhythm that did not depend on permission. A receptionist glanced up briefly from her desk, her eyes scanning him automatically before returning to her screen, the kind of glance that categorized without questioning. And Marcus continued past without reacting, stopping near the glass walls of the conference room where the meeting had just begun to thin, chairs shifting, voices lowering, decisions being wrapped in language that made them sound final. He did not look inside right away. Instead, he reached for a cloth, folding it carefully, aligning the edges with quiet precision before wiping down the surface of a nearby table that did not need cleaning, his movements controlled, intentional, giving the appearance of routine while his attention remained elsewhere. Inside the room, Ethan stood near the head of the table now, one hand resting against the polished wood, his voice confident, easy, as he spoke to one of the executives about timelines and expectations. The large screen behind them still displayed the financial model, its clean lines unchanged, its confidence unshaken, and for a moment, the reflection on the glass aligned just right. Marcus could see both the numbers and the people in the same frame, the projection and the assumption layered together, and something about that alignment held his attention, not emotionally, not reactively, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had already traced the outcome long before it reached this point. He shifted slightly, just enough to angle himself toward the screen, his eyes scanning quickly, efficiently, not reading every number, but identifying patterns, gaps, the subtle imbalance that no one in that room had fully addressed. His hand continued moving across the table, cloth gliding smoothly, leaving behind a surface that reflected light without distortion, and in that reflection, the same flaw existed, invisible to most, obvious to him. Inside the room, one of the executives paused again, his voice lowering as he leaned closer to Ethan. "There is still a concern about the liability structure," he said, quieter now, as if lowering the volume might reduce the weight of the issue. Ethan exhaled lightly, not annoyed, just impatient. "We already covered that," he replied, his tone steady, dismissive in a way that came from certainty rather than understanding. Marcus's hand slowed for just a fraction of a second, not enough to be noticed, but enough to mark the moment. He turned slightly, reaching for the edge of the glass, polishing it in slow, circular motions, his eyes still tracking the conversation inside. The executive hesitated again. "It is not fully resolved," he added, and this time there was no easy way to smooth it over. The words lingered, thin but persistent, like a thread that refused to disappear. Ethan straightened, his reflection sharp against the glass. "Then finalize it," he said, and there it was again. The assumption that solutions existed simply because they were expected to. Marcus finished the last pass across the glass and stepped back, just enough to see the entire room through a surface that now reflected everything clearly. The people, the screen, the imbalance between them. And for a moment, his gaze settled on Ethan, not with judgment, not with anger, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if he were watching a sequence that had already been set in motion. And without a word, without any shift in expression, Marcus turned away, guiding his cart down the corridor, leaving behind a room that believed it was still in control, unaware that the outcome they were moving toward had already been written in a place they had chosen not to see. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with a kind of quiet friction that most people could not name but could feel, like something slightly out of alignment beneath a perfectly smooth surface. And by the time the sun began to lower behind the glass skyline, casting long reflections across the upper floors, the building carried a tension that did not belong to its usual rhythm. In the conference room, the meeting had ended but not resolved. Chairs pushed back just slightly out of place, documents left open on the table as if someone intended to return within minutes. And near the far end of the room, one of the executives remained seated, scrolling slowly through the same section of the report again and again, his brow tightening in small increments. Not panic, not yet, but recognition beginning to take shape. Across the floor, assistants moved faster now, voices quieter, more precise, as if careful wording could contain something that had already started to expand. And near the elevators, Ethan Caldwell stepped out of another meeting, his jacket slung casually over his shoulder, his expression unchanged, still carrying that same effortless confidence, that same distance from consequence. His phone buzzed once in his hand, then again, a series of notifications stacking faster than usual. He glanced down briefly, expecting nothing more than routine updates, messages, confirmations. But the first subject line caught his attention just enough to slow his step. Urgent. Liability exposure review. He frowned slightly, not out of concern but irritation, as if the timing itself was inconvenient. He opened the message, eyes scanning quickly, the words dense, technical, easy to dismiss at a glance. But something in the phrasing did not match the tone he expected. The certainty was missing, replaced by careful language, conditional statements. And that alone was enough to shift something small in his posture. He stopped walking, just for a moment, reading the next line more slowly. And then another message came through, then another, each one building on the last. Not dramatic, not explosive, but consistent, pointing toward the same gap, the same overlooked structure that no longer stayed contained within a single report. Across the floor, a glass door opened sharply, one of the senior executives stepping out with a phone pressed tightly to his ear, his voice low but urgent now. "We need to halt the final review," he said, and even though the words were quiet, they carried weight, the kind that moved through the space without needing to be raised. Ethan looked up, his gaze following the movement, his mind still holding on to the assumption that this was temporary, manageable, something that would correct itself the way everything always had. But then the large screen at the end of the hall flickered, updating automatically, numbers adjusting in real time. Subtle shifts at first, percentages moving by fractions, then by more. Not enough to alarm anyone unfamiliar with the system, but enough to signal instability to those who knew what they were looking at. And across the glass surface, reflections distorted slightly as the data changed. Ethan's reflection among them, no longer perfectly aligned. He stepped closer, almost unconsciously, his attention drawn to the movement on the screen, and for the first time that day, there was no easy dismissal, no immediate answer, just a series of changes that did not respond to confidence or command. Somewhere behind him voices overlapped, controlled but no longer calm, instructions being given, confirmations requested, the steady rhythm of the floor beginning to fracture into something more reactive, more uncertain, and far below, in a space where the light remained steady and the air unchanged. Marcus Reed closed the lid of his laptop with a soft, deliberate motion, the screen fading to black, his reflection disappearing with it. He did not rush, did not react to the noise that had not yet reached him. He simply stood there for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the surface, as if marking the end of something already understood, and when he finally turned toward the door, the building above him was already beginning to move in ways it could not fully control. The building did not sleep that night. Even when the lights dimmed and the upper floors emptied of their usual movement, something remained awake inside its walls, something restless, shifting, recalculating, and outside. The city stretched into darkness, headlights sliding across wet pavement, distant sirens blending into the low hum of traffic, while inside a small maintenance room far below, Marcus Reed sat alone on a narrow chair, his back straight, his hands resting loosely on his knees. Not tense, not relaxed, simply still, the kind of stillness that came from knowing rather than waiting. A single overhead light cast a soft glow across the room, reflecting faintly off the metal shelves and the closed laptop in front of him. Its screen dark now, silent, as if it had already said everything it needed to say. He did not reopen it, did not check for updates, did not chase the movement that was already happening above him. Instead, he listened, not to words, but to the subtle changes in the building itself. The distant echo of hurried footsteps were there. Should have been none at this hour. The soft vibration of elevators moving more frequently than usual. The quiet urgency that traveled through walls and floors without needing to be announced. And somewhere high above, behind glass and polished wood, voices were no longer measured, no longer controlled. Phones pressed tightly to ears, conversations overlapping, numbers being repeated, questioned, recalculated, each repetition carrying a little more weight than the last. And in one of those rooms, Ethan Caldwell stood near the window, the city lights reflecting across the glass behind him, his posture no longer as effortless as it had been earlier, his phone held tighter now, his attention fixed in a way that did not allow distraction. "What do you mean it cannot be adjusted?" he said, his voice low but strained at the edges, and the answer on the other end came quickly, carefully, as if choosing the right words could soften the reality they carried. "The structure is embedded in the agreement. It is not something we can revise overnight." Ethan turned slightly, his reflection shifting in the glass, no longer aligned with the clean image he had carried through the day. "Then delay it," he said, the words coming faster now, searching for control, but the response did not follow the same pattern. "We tried. The counterpart has already flagged the discrepancy. They are pulling back." Silence followed, not empty, but heavy, filled with the sound of something slipping beyond reach. Ethan lowered the phone slightly, his gaze drifting toward the table where documents were spread in uneven lines, no longer organized, no longer certain. And for the first time, there was no immediate solution waiting just beyond his awareness. Only the realization that something had been missed long before this moment, something small, something overlooked, and now it had grown into something that could not be ignored. Far below, Marcus leaned back just slightly, the chair creaking softly beneath him, his eyes closing for a brief second, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement, as if the sequence he had already traced in his mind was now unfolding exactly as expected. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and when he opened his eyes again, nothing in his expression had changed, not satisfaction, not regret, Just the same quiet understanding. He reached for the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against the surface where the laptop rested, then withdrew his hand without opening it. There was nothing more to check, nothing more to confirm, and outside the small window near the ceiling, the first hint of early morning light began to touch the horizon, faint, almost unnoticed, but present, and somewhere above, in rooms that had always operated with certainty, that same light would soon reveal what could no longer be hidden. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with a sharp clarity that stripped away the illusion of control, sunlight cutting through the glass walls of the upper floors and landing directly on screens that had not gone dark all night. Numbers frozen now not because they had stabilized, but because they had fallen into a place no one in that building had prepared for. And in the main conference room, the silence felt different from the day before. No longer controlled, no longer deliberate, but heavy, exposed. The kind of silence that follows realization. Papers still spread across the table, no longer neat, no longer aligned. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, his posture upright but no longer effortless, his eyes fixed on the screen where the final figures held steady, not moving, not correcting, just existing in a way that left no room for interpretation. Across from him, one of the executives spoke quietly, carefully. "The deal is off," he said, not dramatic, not raised, just final. And the words settled into the room without resistance. Another voice followed, lower, almost hesitant. "The exposure has already been flagged by external auditors. It will not stay contained." Ethan did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening slightly, his mind still searching for the point where this could be reversed, where control could be reasserted, but each path closed as quickly as it formed. And then a third voice entered, sharper now, less filtered. "We missed it." And that word lingered, not just as a statement, but as an admission, something that could not be redirected or softened. Ethan finally turned away from the screen, his reflection fading from the glass as he stepped back, his phone vibrating again in his hand. This time, he did not check it right away, as if delaying the confirmation might delay the reality. But the vibration continued, steady, insistent, until he looked down, the notifications no longer controlled. Headlines forming, questions being asked, names being attached to numbers that no longer made sense. And for the first time, the distance he had always relied on began to collapse, not all at once, but in layers, subtle but undeniable. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened quickly, footsteps moving faster than before, voices no longer lowered, instructions overlapping, and beneath it all, the realization that this was no longer internal, no longer manageable within the walls of the building. Far below, Marcus Reed stepped out of the maintenance room, the early light from a narrow window stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines. He paused briefly, looking at the way the light moved across the surface, steady, unchanging, unaffected by what was happening above. Then he picked up his cart, the same one he had pushed the day before, the same one that moved with a soft, rhythmic click against the floor, and began walking toward the elevator, his pace unchanged, his posture the same, as if the world around him had not shifted at all. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped inside, pressing the button for the upper floors without hesitation, and as the numbers climbed, one by one, the building carried him upward into a space that no longer felt as certain as it once had. The doors opened onto the executive level, and the difference was immediate, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. The calm precision replaced by movement that lacked direction, assistants speaking quickly, screens being adjusted, people standing in small clusters with expressions that no longer hid uncertainty. Marcus guided his cart forward, the sound of its wheels cutting softly through the noise, and as he passed the glass walls of the conference room, he did not stop, did not look directly inside, but the reflection caught enough. Ethan standing there, still, surrounded by a reality that no longer responded to him. And Marcus continued walking, not away, not toward, just forward, carrying with him the same quiet presence that had always been there, now seen differently, not because he had changed, but because everything else had. By the time the morning settled into its second hour, the building had lost its rhythm completely. Conversations no longer followed structure, movement no longer followed hierarchy, and for the first time in years, decisions were not being made from the top down, but from a place of reaction, of urgency, of something closer to uncertainty than control, and in the center of it all, Ethan Caldwell stood at the edge of the conference room, no longer surrounded by attention but by distance. The executives who had once deferred to him now speaking in quieter clusters, their focus shifting away, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity, because the situation had outgrown individual authority, and his phone remained in his hand, the screen dimming and lighting again with each incoming message, each one adding detail, each one removing certainty, until finally he lowered it, letting it rest against the table as if the weight of it had become something physical, something he could no longer ignore or carry the same way. Across the room, one of the senior partners spoke with a controlled urgency. "We need someone who understands where this originated," he said, his voice steady but edged with the recognition that time was no longer an ally. Another responded. "We have reviewed every internal report. Nothing flagged this early enough." And that was when the silence returned, not the heavy silence of shock, but a thinner, sharper one, the kind that forms when people begin to realize that the answer they need might exist outside the structure they trust. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the glass wall, where reflections moved in fragments, distorted by motion, and for a brief moment, something from the previous day surfaced, not as a memory he had chosen to revisit, but as an image that refused to disappear, a man standing still in a hallway, calm in a way that had not matched the situation, a voice that had not carried fear or urgency, just certainty. And it lingered longer than expected, longer than comfortable, because now, that certainty felt different, not irrelevant, not dismissible, but connected to something he had not understood at the time. Outside the room, Marcus Reed moved through the corridor with the same measured pace, his cart gliding beside him, the soft sound of its wheels cutting through the scattered conversations, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. A few glances followed him now, not the quick, dismissive ones from before, but longer, uncertain, as if something about his presence no longer fit the category they had assigned to him. And he continued forward without acknowledging any of it, stopping briefly near a side table to adjust a stack of papers that did not require adjustment, his hands precise, controlled, his focus grounded in the physical space around him, while the abstract chaos unfolded just beyond it. And then the conference room door opened, the sound sharper than necessary, drawing attention not because it was loud, but because it marked a shift. Ethan stepped out, his posture still upright, but the ease was gone, replaced by something more deliberate, more aware. His eyes scanning the corridor not with authority, but with intention, searching, and when his gaze settled, it did not land on the executives, or the screens, or the movement around him. It landed on Marcus, standing a few feet away, adjusting the edge of the table. The moment stretched, not long in time, but long enough in meaning, because for the first time, the distance between them was not defined by status, but by understanding. Ethan took a step forward, then another, each movement slower than his usual pace, as if he was navigating something unfamiliar. And when he stopped, just within speaking distance, there was no immediate command, no dismissal, just a pause, a recalibration of everything he had assumed. Marcus looked up slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the presence in front of him, his expression unchanged, steady, and in that quiet space between them, the imbalance that had once defined their interaction no longer held, not because it had been corrected, but because it had been revealed for what it was, temporary, fragile, and already shifting into something else. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the noise of the floor seemed to dim without actually fading, like the building itself had stepped back just enough to let the silence exist. Ethan Caldwell stood there with something unfamiliar in his posture, not weakness, not defeat, but the absence of certainty. The absence of the invisible structure that had always supported him without question, his hands no longer moving, no longer gesturing, just still at his sides as if he was recalculating where to place them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not controlled in the same effortless way, but measured, careful. "You knew," he said, not accusing, not demanding, just stating something he had only just begun to understand. Marcus Reed did not answer immediately. He finished, aligning the edge of the papers in front of him, fingertips brushing lightly across the surface to ensure everything sat exactly where it should. Then he lifted his gaze slightly, meeting Ethan's eyes with the same steady calm that had been there from the beginning. "I saw it," he replied, his tone even, neither defensive nor proud, just clear. Ethan exhaled, a small breath that carried more weight than it should have, his eyes shifting briefly toward the conference room behind him, where voices continued in low urgency, where decisions were being made without the certainty they once carried. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, and this time the question held something deeper, not just confusion, but the beginning of responsibility. Marcus paused, not because he needed time to think, but because the answer did not belong to a single moment. It belonged to a pattern, to a series of choices that had already been made long before this day. "Because no one was listening," he said quietly, and the words did not land with force. They settled, simple, undeniable. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, pieces aligning in a way that did not offer comfort, only clarity. He nodded once, a small, almost automatic movement, then looked back at Marcus. "Can you fix it?" he asked, and there it was, the instinct returning. The expectation that solutions existed, that problems could be reversed if the right person stepped in. Marcus held his gaze for a moment longer, not searching, not judging, just observing. And then he shook his head, slowly, not as refusal, but as truth. "It is already in motion," he said, his voice steady. "What you are seeing now is not the problem. It is the result." The words created a space between them that could not be closed with authority or urgency. Ethan looked down briefly, his reflection faint in the polished surface of the table beside him, no longer sharp, no longer defined by certainty, just present. And when he looked back up, something had shifted, not resolved, not repaired, but acknowledged. He nodded again, this time more deliberately. "I understand," he said, and it was not complete, not fully formed, but it was real. Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, not as agreement, but as recognition of that shift, and without another word, he reached for the handle of his cart, turning it gently, the wheels moving forward with their familiar soft rhythm. He did not wait for permission, did not look back. He simply continued down the corridor, past the glass walls, past the scattered conversations, past the place where everything had begun to change, and behind him, Ethan remained where he stood, not following, not calling out, just watching for a moment longer before turning back toward the room that no longer felt the same. And as Marcus walked, the sunlight stretched further across the floor, catching the edges of the polished surface, reflecting a quiet, steady light that did not shift with status or power, only with time. And in that light, the building seemed different, not because it had changed, but because what had always been there could no longer be ignored.